Good evening, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's talk, Preoccupations, Whatever Happened to Prehistory in Palestine, with Dr. Brian Boyd. Dr. Boyd is the co-director of the Center for Palestine Studies, a senior lecturer in anthropology, director of museum anthropology, and co-chair of the seminar on human-animal studies at Columbia University. We're delighted to have him with us this evening. For over 15 years, the Amman Global Center has been dedicated to fostering spaces for research, knowledge exchange, and collaboration across Jordan and the wider region. Through our programs and initiatives, we partner with local and regional institutions and individuals to address pressing issues and to leverage unique opportunities. In tonight's talk, Dr. Boyd will address an often overlooked topic, the near total absence of prehistoric research in contemporary archaeology of Palestine. Brian will trace how the concept of prehistory was introduced during the Mandate period, embedding frameworks that continue to shape archaeological studies today. While the role of archaeology in constructing historical and political narratives is well studied, the lasting influence of these frameworks has received less attention. Revisiting these structures is key to understanding how knowledge is produced. The frameworks we use not only shape historical narratives, but also influence public perceptions and higher education. By reassessing inherited structures, we can create space for deeper, more critical engagement with history and its contemporary implications, as well as considering its role in shaping more representative interpretations of the past. These are the kinds of questions Brian has dedicated a lot of his research to addressing. His work focuses on the prehistory and politics of archaeology in Southwest Asia, with a particular focus on Palestine. His ongoing fieldwork in the West Bank centers on a community archaeology and museum project in the landscapes of the village of Shukba, northwest of Ramallah. Brian is currently in Amman for an interdisciplinary conference entitled From Palestinian Archaeology to the Archaeology of the Nakba, Exploring New Directions, which he co-organized with Dr. Mazen Gwaisi, a postdoctoral scholar at Queen's University, Belfast, and Dr. Jamal Barghouth from the Palestinian Institute for Cultural Landscape Studies, both of whom are here with us this evening. Welcome. The conference is funded by Columbia University's Institute of Social and Economic Research. In addition to his fieldwork, Dr. Boyd has served in key leadership roles, including co-chairing the anthropology division of the New York Academy of Sciences and serving on the boards of the Palestinian American Research Center and the Theoretical Archaeology Group in both the United Kingdom and North America. Our event this evening is in partnership with the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia University. Before we hear from Brian, I would like to mention that following the talk, we'll open the floor for a Q&A session. Afterwards, we invite you to join us for a reception in the courtyard to continue the conversation in a more informal setting. Thank you all for being here, and now please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Boyd to the stage.
Thank you, Hanya. I didn't expect so many people, I have to say. This was a surprise. Thank you so much for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm a little bit jet-lagged. I had a 14-hour flight from New York 2 days ago, and I'm still a little bit not quite focused yet, but hopefully what I'm going to say is make some sense. It will make some sense. Before I start, I'd like to thank Hanya and Dana and Ahmed and Rita and Diala from the Global Center, and they've been so, their hospitality is fantastic. They've made us feel really welcome and relaxed and comfortable, even though we're not talking about a particularly comfortable topic, this archaeology of the Nakba. And again, thanks to Mazen and Jamal for my partners in crime, as it were. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today, it's the wrong PowerPoint that's on the screen here. This is the talk I gave this afternoon. That's the one called Public Lecture.
This one?
Yeah, it's not this one. Okay, no, it's not that one. It's called Public Lecture. Okay, I'll tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to address the topic of prehistory in Palestine, as the title says. And I particularly want to think about the colonial development of the subject. And I want to sort of interrogate why prehistory doesn't really figure as dominantly or prominently as it used to in the archaeology of Palestine. And we can think about some of the reasons for that. I'm going to talk about that today. That's the one. Okay. Perfect. شكرا كتير. And so the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to read some notes for the first sort of 10 minutes, maybe, something like that. And then I'm just going to talk with illustrations, and then we can have the Q&A. I'll need my glasses for this. In 2021, prehistoric archaeology in Palestine made global media headlines for the first time since Kathleen Kenyon's excavations at Jericho in the 1950s. I recount this here, not only because Palestine is my own area of research, but also because the news seemed to have implications for a particular narrative long held central in world archaeology. These are some of the media headlines from 2021. Most southerly evidence of Neanderthals revealed in cave in Palestine. Neanderthal child's tooth found in Palestinian cave tells a tale of Africa. Long lost Neanderthal tooth reveals a surprising unknown link to modern humans. African technology associated with southernmost Neanderthals, and Neanderthals in the West Bank had Homo sapiens technology. The cave in question is Shukba, located in the Wadi Natuf, northwest of Ramallah in the West Bank. The circumstances and historical significance of the archaeological material here in this cave, which was discovered, so-called. My students have a great term for discovered. They call it Columbusing. So not really discovered. The locals already knew, yeah. This cave was explored, let's say, in 1928 by during the first decade of the colonial British mandate, by the British archaeologist Dorothy Garrod and a workforce of local villagers. This is the Wadi Natuf. And I'm going to talk about the circumstances of that project in 1928, and then trace the development of prehistory in Palestine throughout the 20th century. But first, I want just to say a word about this kind of peculiar notion, construction of European late modernity prehistory. As I'm sure you all know, archaeological research in Palestine has been dominated by historical and theological perspectives since its inception as a formal academic discipline in the early 20th century. But these perspectives, the theological, the historical, form only part of archaeology's broad intellectual history in the region. Alongside historical and theological perspectives runs the study of prehistory. That is, the study of pre-literate societies or communities from the earliest known hominin presence in the Jordan Valley, which is about 1.5 million years ago, to those of the late Chalcolithic, which is approximately 5,500 years ago. Now, interestingly, research and teaching on prehistory in Palestinian universities currently finds itself in a much reduced state compared to institutions across the Green Line. And active field projects on prehistoric sites are extremely rare, in contrast to the plethora of Israeli excavations and surveys, both in Israel and in West Bank Area C. Further, there exists a perception that prehistory is somehow separate from, stands outside, the politicization of archaeology so prevalent in contemporary nation-state and settler-colonial discourse in Israel, Palestine, and elsewhere. But this is certainly not the case. As I want to talk about here this evening, the study of prehistory in Palestine is equally entwined with its settler-colonial history and present, and the relationship between the search for European origins and current archaeological concerns in Israel and Palestine. The kind of prehistory that had been established in Europe by the 1920s was one largely concerned with its own origins and development. The archaeologist V. Gordon Childe, Australian archaeologist but working in the UK, was amongst the first to argue for, quote, a Near Eastern origin for European society, by arguing that a number of key features of European prehistory, transformations or revolutions in technology, material culture, economic and social organization, and ritual and religious practices, originated in the prehistoric cultures of the Near East. The archaeological narratives established by archaeologists like Childe and his contemporaries in the late 1920s and 1930s were characterized by discussions of cultural origins, the evolution and spread of ethnic groups, and key revolutions in the development of humanity, the agricultural revolution, the urban revolution, and so on. It's basically a colonial search for European origins, and thus the beginnings and rise of civilization in the Near East, as they called it. And so when European prehistorians arrived to carry out research in Palestine in the 1920s for the first time, this was the intellectual milieu, the kinds of nascent archaeological lines of inquiry that they carried with them from Europe. In this way, the archaeological research questions and the interpretive and epistemological frameworks that were embedded in the infrastructures of European colonialism served as the interpretive model or scaffolding for the study of prehistory in Palestine from the 1920s onwards. The temporal or chronological sequence that had been developed for Europe, excuse me, from the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, to the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, was imported from Europe into Palestine by the early prehistorians of the colonial British and French mandates. And that's what I'm going to start by talking about now. These are a few names that I'm going to be discussing. European archaeologists, particularly from the 1920s, Francis Turville-Petre, Alexis Malone, Dorothy Garrod, René Neuville. So the first prehistoric research that was carried out in Palestine in the 1920s was close to Lake Tiberias, in the sort of upper part of the Jordan Valley, particularly here in the Wadi Amud, called Amud for obvious reasons, the stone pillar, and a series of caves in this wadi, Zutiye, and some others. The archaeologist here was Francis Turville Petre, and he excavated in Zutiye Cave in 1925. And he's a kind of forgotten figure, as this article by Bar Yosef and Jane Callender suggest. His archaeological career didn't really extend much beyond the 1930s, really. He was working from 25 to 31, I think, in Palestine. And here is the Zutiye Cave during Turville Petre's excavations. And the reason this cave is important was because Turville Petre and his team of local workers found this hominin skull, the so-called Galilee skull. And at the time, Turville Petre thought it was some kind of hybrid hominin, something not quite Neanderthal, but not quite modern human. We know today it's actually a kind of archaic, old form of a anatomically modern human, and it's been studied in numerous ways. But that was the first prehistoric research, Turville Petre in the Wadi Amud in the Jalil, in the Galilee. At the same time, in 1924, Father Alexis Malone from the University of Saint-Joseph in Beirut was traveling on donkey from Lid to Jamala through the Wadi Natuf. And he noticed this cave. This is the cave of Shukba. Mm-hmm. And he went into the cave and he started, as archaeologists do, scraping around and found some prehistoric stone tools. And he published them in 1925. But he was really interested in later periods, Chalcolithic and things like that. And so he spoke to the director of the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, who was John Garstang at the time. And Garstang said, well, we have a young student who's just arrived from Iraq, this British woman coming from Cambridge University, Dorothy Garrod. And she had worked on a lot of prehistoric sites in Europe, in France in particular, in Britain, also in Iraq. She'd been a student of the Abbé Breuil, and so she had learned her prehistory from him. And Garstang at the British School suggested to Dorothy Garrod to go to investigate this cave at Shukba, which she did in April 1928. And I have here the photographs from Garrod's archive that are held at the moment by Oxford University and also at the Saint-Germain-en-Laye Museum just outside Paris. And I'd like just to quickly show you these because they're an interesting moment, of course, in Palestinian history. It's the first decade of the British Mandate. And this is the village of Shukba in April 1928. I say it's just northwest of Ramallah. And here is the cave with Garrod's excavations already underway in the Wadi Natuf. And it's interesting, on this excavation, she employed local laborers from Shukba and from two neighboring villages, Shabtin and Kibya. And it's very interesting to read her notebooks and things. I'll talk about that in a moment, discussing the work there. This is the cave, and she worked there for 3 months with this team. She was funded by some donors in America as well as in the UK. And she found there's 2 important archaeological discoveries from Shukba. One, as we've seen in the headlines earlier, she found some Neanderthal remains. So we know now something like 50,000 years old. although this is pre-radiocarbon dating, so she didn't really know the dates, but she was able to recognize the material. And she also found a very thick layer belonging to what we now call the Epipaleolithic. And she called this the Natufian, named after the Wadi Natuf, where it was found. It was the equivalent to the European Mesolithic at the time. And she found a number of human burials, lots of flint tools, and she published this material very, very quickly. She worked here 1928, and then moved on to the Carmel Caves, which I'll talk about in a moment. And she published this material in the 30s and 40s. But it's amazing to look at the village of Shukba, some of the photographs from 1928. And I mean, these houses are still in existence. This is where I'm working with Hamid Salem from Birzeit University and his students. This is looking from Shukba across to Birzeit. And it's a very interesting anthropological, ethnographic record that we see here. We see lots of visitors, Americans, and people from the region coming to visit. But we really get an interesting insight into, local vernacular architecture, dress, and so on. And when we first started working at Shukba, and I'll talk about this a little later, we showed these pictures to the people living there today, to the town council and so on. And we're trying to identify the people in the pictures, most of whom are not still alive, of course. But we have been able to identify the descendants, the children and things like that of some of the people in the photographs. And this is Garud's notebook, her excavation notebook. It says there, April the 4th, 1928, drew plan of cave. And she goes into a lot of detail about the excavation and things like that. So I've been digitizing all this material as well. Here she is with two of her American funders and a visit from Alexis Malone, who had actually found the site in the first place in April 28. So we've got this amazing photographic record of her work there and of the local people in Shukba. Now, she only worked there, and I'm just going to keep going through these, for 3 months. It's been a hard day here, obviously, because she intended to return in 1929, but the Palestine Department of Antiquities had a different idea, and they asked her to go north to the Wadi al-Maghara, just south of Haifa, on the Mediterranean coast, because the caves and the surrounding landscape was being quarried for stone because they were building a new harbour for ships in Haifa. And so they said, well, look, you've found some interesting material in Shukba. There's lots of interesting caves here. Why don't you just go there, have a look around? So she went there and spent the next 6.5 years excavating these caves, some of which are very, very well known, which I'll talk about in a moment. So these are the Wadi al-Maghara, the Mount Carmel caves. And that's just a map where you can see where they are. Here she is with colleagues at Mount Carmel. Here's her excavation underway. And if you want the names of the caves, here they are. Tabun, Jamal, Elwad, and Skul. The excavations at Tabun are particularly interesting. You can see here that she's working with, in this trench here, with, do I have a pointer? Yeah. You can see here, these are her workers. And these are all local young Palestinian women, girls. They're all like 16 to 25 years old, something like that. And when I was initially looking at her work, I was thinking, Garrod, a single British woman, shows up in the 1920s in Palestine with a team of women and comes to Mount Carmel, goes to all the local villages and says, I want a team of women to work with me. And I was thinking, this is really interesting, because the photographs from Shukba, from 28, there are no women in the pictures. It's all men working. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? I'm thinking this is a real early feminist gender statement or something like this. And then I started to read her notebooks from Shukba. And every couple of pages, she's talking about the men from Kibya, Shabtin, and Shukba. And you can feel the frustration. She's saying, another fight broke out amongst the men today. They were fighting and arguing and physical, punching each other, all this kind of thing. So I think when she got to Mount Carmel, she's like, there's no way I'm working with men here. So the men came in to do the heavy lifting, all the kind of wheelbarrows and things like that. But the careful, meticulous excavation work was all done for 6 years by these young women. One of whom she tried to get to come to Cambridge, actually, to do a master's, but the Nakba happened, right, in the 40s. Tabun is important because it was there that Garrod and this young woman who wanted to come to Cambridge found the very first Neanderthal in this region, the very first Neanderthal outside Europe. This is like 1929, 1930. And this is the Tabun Neanderthal. She also found the remains of modern human skeletons that we now know are about 90,000 years old, very early, so just come out of Africa, basically, in school. And these are just some pictures of these. And in the cave called El Wad, in the center of the cave system, she found decorated bone and stone artifacts like these ones here, and around 100 human burials, many of them decorated, like this one we can see here with the decorated skull. And this material belonged to the same kind of cultural group that she found at Shukba, this Natufian. As I say, she published this material in 1937, The Stone Age of Mount Carmel. At the same time, in the early 30s, Turval Petre was also, he'd moved on from the Galilee area, and he excavated in this cave at Kibara, also on Mount Carmel. And he found, again, similar material to Garrod's Natufian material. So they were putting together this kind of cultural entity, if you like, in that old language. I love this amazingly queer picture of Turval Petre, Garrod, Theodore McCone, who's their physical anthropologist. They're just so louche, that kind of... But they were friends with the Bloomsbury set and all that very kind of gay community in London. Moving on into the 1950s. Now, of course, 1948, we have the establishment of the State of Israel. And the prehistoric research was still largely being carried out by European archaeologists. This is Jean Perrault at Ain Malacha in the Upper Jordan Valley. That's the Jolan in the background that you're looking at towards the Lebanese border as well. Perrault found another Natufian epipaleolithic site at Ain Malacha. It's still under excavation today, if you can believe it. So there's been projects there since the 1950s. Here is Ain Malacha, the actual village of Malacha, on the survey for Western Palestine from the 1870s on the map. The reason I'm emphasizing this Epipaleolithic Natufian is because it's central to the domestication of plants and animals for the very first time anywhere in the world. The Natufian have domesticated the dog, and they are starting to make the initial steps towards the domestication of certain plant foods like wild wheat and things like that in this so-called Fertile Crescent. As I said earlier, these are the questions that European archaeologists were interested in because they wanted to understand their own origins. The spread of agriculture, the spread of civilization from the Near East into Europe. And these were the dominant research questions by Garrod, by Perrault, by Turville-Petre, all the people we're mentioning here. Just a couple of pictures of Ein Malacha. It's called Enan in Hebrew. This is the Hula, of course, looking across to Jordan. And Perrault excavated a number, for the very first time anywhere in the region, what seemed to be permanent dwelling structures, permanent, he called it a village, actually, one of the earliest villages. It's a modern term, obviously, we can debate that kind of thing. But he found a whole lot of material that he found convincing. He said that the Natufians, as he called them, he gave them a tribal name, the Natufians, were probably the world's first agriculturists. And he pointed to this, you can see there's a gloss, if you like, on the edge of the sickles. I don't think this is working. Okay. Which is indicative of gathering or cutting cereal plants, he argued. And this is just some more material from that. At the same time, Perrault was working at Ein Malacha. The British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon is at Tel Es Sultan, Jericho. And here she is. She's always got a cigarette in her hand in photographs. Every single photograph you see of her, she's either got a cigarette or a trowel. And here is Tel Es Sultan in 1952. I'm sure I don't need to tell you what we're looking at here. There is the Tel. But this is one of the very first Palestinian refugee camps after the Nakba in 48. But interestingly, most of the people who were working with Kenyon don't come from this refugee camp at all. They come from a couple of camps a little bit further away. I'm not quite sure why that was. Yeah. I'll talk to you more about it. So as you all know, I know there's some CBRL people here, so everyone's familiar with Kenyon. I should tell you this as well. When I was doing my PhD in the early 90s, I wrote most of my PhD at the British School of Archaeology in Sheikh Jarrah, and at the time there were only 2 photographs on the wall. One was of the Queen, the British Queen, and one was Kathleen Kenyon. They were the 2 photographs on the wall in the library. So she carried out this extensive project, as you know, at Tel Es Sultan from 1952 to 58, 59. And excavated it by hand, basically. There's no machinery here. Cut these huge trenches through the Tel. And in terms of prehistory, everyone will be familiar with the large pre-pottery Neolithic stone tower that she uncovered, which seems to be some kind of ceremonial monument. There are burials inside it, down at the bottom of the stairs. There's a staircase inside it. And of course, she also uncovered the famous headless skulls headless skeletons, and their plastered skulls that I'm sure everyone is quite familiar with from the earliest. She called it the pre-pottery Neolithic because it had all the hallmarks of the Neolithic, some domesticated plants, domesticated animals, but no pottery, so she called it pre-pottery Neolithic. And most of these skulls are now in the museum in Amman. Here they are. Yeah, some of them here too. So that's the 1950s. It's very interesting when you look at Kenyon's excavation notes. She never mentions the politics of the region at the time, even though it's literally 3-4 years after the initial Nakba, in 48. She started here 52, but she never discusses politics, never discusses the situation with the refugee camps around the site, nothing like that. She just focuses on the archaeology. That's really it. Despite all these tumultuous developments that are happening. As we move into the 1960s, and I'm conscious of time here, so I'm going to go through some of this quite quickly because I want to talk to you about our project at Shukba. This is when the early 1960s is when there's a big shift in prehistory in the region. Some of the Europeans start to withdraw a little, and we get the establishment of the first departments of prehistory in the Israeli universities, at the Hebrew University, and then Tel Aviv slightly later, Haifa slightly later. And there's a lot of funding for these prehistoric projects. We have, this is the site of Ubediyeh, just south of the Lake Tiberias, excavated by the Hebrew University's Institute of Prehistory initially in the early 1960s. And it's very important for, as we know now, for being on that corridor where early hominins came out of Africa into Asia, into Southwest Asia. But this was the start of the Israeli domination, if you like, of prehistory. The so-called Wadi Fala, which is the Israelis call Nahal Oren, this small cave site down here, also on Mount Carmel. And the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, the domination of characters like Ofer Bar Yosef, the so-called doyen of prehistory in Israel. So these large projects run by Israelis, often in collaboration with French archaeologists, less so British. And it's really at this time we start to see the withdrawal of British projects in particular from this part of the world. We have Diana Kirkbride, American, at Beda here in Jordan. A couple of British projects, but further north, this is Abu Huraira in Syria. But it's really, as we get into these later decades of the 20th century, it's the Israeli archaeologists, the archaeology that starts to dominate, and the dominant narrative is those developed by the Israelis. Now, obviously, that's not the case across the border, where we have large US excavations at Ain Ghazal, for example. Again, these pre-pottery Neolithic material. These amazing, I'm sure you've seen these in the Amman Museum. These pre-pottery Neolithic statues. I don't get a sense of scale here. Yeah, they're about like this height, something like that. But they're very peculiarly alien-looking, aren't they? Yeah. But they're even on, this shows you the cultural impact of the archaeology here. They're even on postage stamps and things like that. The Israelis continue with their excavations in Palestine, in what is now Israel, of course, 48 Palestine. Again, at Kibara, some more Neanderthal excavations. I'm just going to go through these quickly. New Hebrew University excavations at Amud. And these are just some pictures from further north, again from Dedirie, where we have also Neanderthal children, amazingly, 5-year-old Neanderthals. But as I say, it's really the Israelis that dominate the situation now. And especially since Oslo, since the division of the West Bank into areas A, B, and C, the Israelis are not just working in 48 Palestine and Israel. They're also making serious inroads into projects in Area C. And if things work out in the next few weeks, they're going to start making inroads into Area B too. There's already biblical excavations happening in Area B. So this is something we have to be extremely worried about, of course. I'm just going to skip through these because I want to get back to Shukba. So, as I say, Garud did this one season of excavations in Shukba in 1928. It's never been touched since. And so in 1999-2000, while I was teaching in the UK, I contacted what was the Department of Antiquities in Palestine, Hamdan Taha, at the time, to say I would like to maybe start a project or at least do some exploratory work in Shukba cave, to come ask some modern questions of the material that Garud is looking at, bring modern excavation techniques to the cave, and so on. And of course, Garud only excavated in the cave. She didn't look outside on the terrace. So I thought that would be interesting to explore. So I came here with a very small team. Professor Zoe Crossland, and this is Mahmoud Shalash, who's one of the big. Shalash is one of the big families. There are two big families in Shukba. There's Shalash and there's Masri. Yeah. If Safwan was here, he would. Yeah. So we wanted to start this project in 2000, but of course the second Intifada started, and we were unable really to make any progress on the project. And also Hamdan Taha was a little bit reluctant to give it to, I was a junior scholar at the time, but anyway, it didn't work out. And so I'd been trying to get back there ever since, really. And then my good friend and colleague Jamal Barghouth here, in 2007 or 8 maybe, Jamal, you sent me this picture and said, this is what the Wadi Natuf looks like today. And what this is that the Israelis have established a massive stone quarry in the Wadi Natuf, which is this internationally significant archaeological landscape, right? And this is what it looks like in 2008. So I met Hamid Salem, Dr. Hamid Salem from Birzeit University in 2011 at a conference in the UK, and I said, what's happening at the Wadi Natuf? Because surely, Shukba is under, there must be some archaeological intervention here. They can't just, if this was in Israel, if this was in Mount Carmel today, or in the Galilee, there'd be an international outcry. They wouldn't be allowed to be quarrying on this scale. But there we are. I'll talk more about that. So Hamid and I and a team of undergraduate students from Birzeit came here in 2012. And this is what the Wadi and the cave looked like then. So this is 4 years after Jamal's photograph. We see a sort of burned out Israeli ambulance. This pile of material here, this is not natural. This is a 20-meter high mountain of garbage that's been dumped there. As we can see, you've got all this garbage. And basically, this is a new road. This is a settler road connecting the settlements. Neely and a couple of the other ones, I don't know which, that basically, the settlers can travel around this part of the West Bank without having to go near Ramallah. This is a road that goes from just north of Ramallah to Tel Aviv. And this is what the Wadi Natuf looked like in 2012. You can see the quarry in the background. So anyway, we did some investigation into this, and it was much, much more complicated than I envisaged. Because as you can see, there's a lot of Hebrew writing here. And I'm thinking, right, so why are the Israelis dumping stuff here? What's going on? It turns out that the landowner of the Wadi Natuf, was being paid $50 for every truckload of Israeli garbage that was coming from various places around the settlements in the West Bank. But there's also toxic material here from hospitals in Ramallah that have somehow ended up here. And the people from the village, from Shukba, are saying, it's contaminating our water, people are getting sick, things like that. So there's this kind of toxic environment. This is you can hopefully see here. Here's Shukba at the top. There's Kibya, there's Shabtin, and these are two of the settlements. But this large feature right in the middle, that's the quarry. The quarry is almost bigger than the villages. You can see the size. And that's 2016, this Google Earth. You can see here someone has written on it, Shukba Cave, here discovered the remains of Natufian. Mm-hmm. So I've been working there every year since 2012-13, apart from during COVID. And every year the quarry just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This is what so basically they're quarrying for stone, for settlement construction, for road construction, things like that. This is a it's a natural landscape. There's no archaeological consultation here whatsoever. If this was anywhere else in like Israel or if it was Jordan, if it was Europe or the US, and someone was just digging a quarry like this, there would be outcry. At the very least, there would be archaeologists in front of the bulldozers, making sure that no sites were being destroyed. There's clearly sites are being destroyed here, prehistoric sites, and because people are not just living in the cave in the prehistoric period; they're using the landscape, and they are just basically churning up the landscape, destroying it, destroying the archaeological evidence that is quite certainly there. And there's also environmental activists, Palestinian environmental activists protesting, and they stand up on this side of the wadi, waving flags saying, no quarrying here, and the army just come and shoot over their heads to disperse them, things like that. And it's also having a really detrimental effect on the natural environment. There used to be a lot of gazelles migrating here. You used to see gazelles every morning when you came onto the wadi early. You never see them now. Never see them. And of course, it's half a kilometre away from the apartheid wall. So it's not just the quarry, it's the wall. In fact, the wall cuts Shukba's agricultural lands. So here's what it looked like when I first went in 2000. There it is now. Okay. But undeterred, we've still been doing work there. The other thing is that Shukba the village is partly in Area B and partly in Area C. The cave and the wadi are in Area C. So we can't do any excavations, for example, because we would have to get the permission of the Israeli civil administration. And because of BDS and so on, we don't engage with that. So we're doing everything we can, but not excavation at the moment. Some of the borders, Area B, Area C, they're constantly shifting. When I went there in 2013, all of Shukba was Area B. Then 2 years later, there was some of it in Area C, some in B. And then today, last year, Most of it has been moved back to Area B. There's a little bit of Area C. But the cave, the Israelis are keeping the cave, the archaeological treasures of prehistory to themselves. Anyway, we spoke with the town council at Shukba and said, look, we're really stuck. What do we do? And they said, what we would really like is to have an archaeological museum, a community museum in the village. And so we've been trying to raise funding. We've raised some money to establish a community museum, which will be based on the archaeology of the Wadi Natuf and the cave at Shukba, but also a local community museum. People are already donating agricultural implements and things like this. And they have given us a space. They have given us the bottom floor of one of the mosques in the village. And this, for some reason, this is not waqf. I don't know why. They said, no, it's not waqf, it's fine. You can have the ground floor. So they've given us, this is it. They have given us really nice, large space. And so at the moment, we're raising funding to start put a floor, start dividing it up, start designing it. What might a nice small community museum look like? Here is our team a couple of years ago. These are all, I think nearly everyone here is an undergraduate student. That's myself and Hamid Salem in the middle. And we get the students to do, sort of routine archaeological work, drawing, photography, survey, all these kind of things. And this is inside the cave, of course. And we're allowed to do a little bit of basic exploration work. We're trying to, identify the limits of Garrett's work, and hopefully one day we'll be able to do some excavations. But one of the really fun things we've been doing is, as I was mentioning gender earlier, of course, was going back to Garrett's photographs and replacing all the colonial archaeologists with the Birzeit students. So this is the American George Woodbury, who is one of her funders. And this is Rua Mujahid from Birzeit, looking suitably defiant, I think. And another one here, a nameless Palestinian laborer here, Yusra Ghanem, also from Birzeit. And we're working with this team of Ibrahim from Al-Quds. And we're doing a digital 3D mapping of the cave. This is Ramzi Hassan, who's from Palestine but now works in Norway. And we're doing things like outreach to local schools, our students, and working with the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, teaching the students about the archaeology and of the landscape, and talking to them about, there is a pre-1948 world here, it's quite interesting. And we get them to do lots of different exercises. And we're also doing architectural survey of the later buildings. This is something that Hamid and these students are more interested in. It's mostly Ottoman, but there are some Mamluk buildings. And then just to finish with, as I say, in 2021, a colleague of mine from the Max Planck Institute in Germany found this Neanderthal child's tooth that Garrett had excavated in 1928. And they did all these analysis, dated them and all this kind of stuff. So we know now for sure that the Neanderthals were living in this cave 50,000 years ago. And it's the southernmost Neanderthal fossil evidence that we have anywhere. As you know, Neanderthals belong in Europe and in the Levant, in Southwest Asia. And there are one or two possible sites in southern Jordan where we have some stone tools that may have been Neanderthal, produced by Neanderthals. But in terms of actual skeletal material, we know that that Shukba is the most southerly point that Neanderthals have reached. There's no Neanderthals in Africa, for example, North Africa. But their technology is influenced by communities from North Africa, modern humans. So they're going there and back. It's a matter of time before we find Neanderthals in North Africa. mark my words. And so we're just doing various sampling and things. Oh, sorry. This is us taking rock samples. There's Hamid. And we're also doing oral histories in Shukba with the students in the bakery and with various local people, and then trying to tie Shukba into the wider landscape. It's amazing to work with Idris Awatle. He's from Jericho, and his family are Bedouin, and he's an undergraduate student, and he's the most amazing person to have in the landscape. He's absolutely amazing. You know, at this point here, I was walking around this landscape for days, not finding anything. I said, there's no prehistoric stuff here. There's no prehistoric stuff here whatsoever. And he's like, of course there's not, because there's no water, you idiot. I was like, why would people be living here? You know. So, anyway, he's amazing. So. Anyway, so that's the project, and as I say, there's no prehistory being carried out. The Shukba project is the only prehistoric project being carried out in the West Bank today. Whereas, over the border, we have 100 prehistoric projects being done in 48 Israel and in Area C by the Israelis. So there's a whole, the West Bank is a blank map when it comes to prehistory. There's very, very few sites there's been practically no survey work, and there's been, excavations in 1928, things like that, but there's very, very little else. Jericho in the 50s, obviously. But there have been no new projects, Palestinian, but because what Palestinian archaeologists are doing is they're trying to counter the Israeli narratives, the biblical archaeology and so on. So they're focusing on, Canaanite archaeology and Bronze Age, Iron Age, things like that. They're not really interested in prehistory. But when you talk to the local people, they're amazing. They know all about this stuff. They know about Garud. They know there's Neanderthals in the cave. Mahmoud Shalash said to me, in this cave, monkey men. So there's a local knowledge, there's an understanding, there's an awareness. And they know that Natufian are the first agriculturists. Everyone in the village knows at Shukba, this is where people first broke the land 10,000 years ago. They have this kind of folk understanding. It's amazing. It's amazing to work here. It's a privilege. But we're under constant pressure now with this constantly moving borders. Okay, I've spoken for an hour. I've spoken way too long. I'm sorry. Yeah, but shukran kathir. Thank you for listening. Thank you. I've been asked to field my own questions. So I would love to. So if anyone has any comments, questions, criticisms, ideas, I'm happy to hear them. Is anyone familiar with this material? This like old prehistoric? Because this is what I mean. It's unfamiliar, but it's in terms of world archaeology, Palestine has such a central place. It's the first place on the planet that people settle down, build permanent dwellings. It's the first place on the planet where people domesticate plants and animals: dogs, sheep, goats, cattle, wheat, barley. Palestine is the origin of this. Not that I'm interested in origins, but yeah. You got a question?
I would say a supplementary comment rather than a question.
Okay.
Brian, it's a great pleasure to work with you and to see you in person for the first time. We've been working together for a while, I would say. I think the project is amazing.
Can I sit down?
Oh yes, please. In leaving the cave and looking at the landscape and the connection between the cave and the broader environment, and I think my sense a few years ago, I have a strong social ties to Shukba, so many friends. that I tend to visit whenever I go back home to see the family. And a few years ago, I traveled to Shukba and to basically, to hang out with the friends there. And it was the first time it occurred to me to notice the landscape, to really driving through that, zigzag road from Ramallah, climbing down the mountains, the West Bank, all the way towards the coast. And I think the significance of that area environmentally is that it sits between the coastal plain and the mountains. So when you climb up to Ramallah, you're going high in elevation, and then the weather is colder, obviously, and all that. But that landscape can open my eyes that this is a different landscape where I live in the center of the West Bank, and it's completely different than when you drive a few kilometers down towards the coast.
Absolutely.
So I think, I know that the landscape is going through a harsh transformation and erasure, and we've been writing about this. I think we should give more attention to that landscape, and find a way to how to link the inside the cave to the outside. I know you've been doing, you're trying to establish that connection.
This is something we've been trying to do. Is this one? Yeah. We're planning to do, if we can do work this summer, we're going to do extensive landscape survey between Shukba and Kibya, and to try to understand, where are they getting the raw material from, things like that. So landscape survey is the big part of the next part of the project. But it's interesting you mentioned the sea, because this is some of the students who come from Birzeit or some of the villages around Birzeit. When they come to Shukba, we can climb onto the top of the cave and they can see the Mediterranean. It's the only time they've ever seen the Mediterranean in their lives. It's extraordinary. But landscape survey is a priority, absolutely. Yeah, because the Israelis do site-based archaeology. It's always site-based, but landscape archaeology is the way forward, obviously. So that's the plan. Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for this very important lecture. My name is Khalid Ayad. I hold a PhD in politics, political science, and another PhD in history. And I'm doing another PhD in philosophy.
That's a lot of PhDs.
Yes, sir. Thanks to Jordan, that offers the Palestinians before the Jordanians opportunities, not just an opportunity to progress. If I may say so, sir, that your very important project may be better in the domain of the dialogue of civilizations, not necessarily to put it in a conflict zone. There are so many conflict zones, but the prehistory or prehistorical domain for me is like the international waters. It belongs to humanity.
Agreed.
And I think your project is huge because it shed a light on all human origins. So if it can be in the concept of dialogue between civilizations, I think maybe these piles of, excuse my language, rubbish that you have shown us may be removed by UNICEF or maybe removed by some international powers. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. We have been trying to get it moved. Yeah. If anyone is interested, there's a book by a colleague of mine, Sophia Stamatopoulou-Robbins, who was at Columbia, but she's now at Bard University, which is just north of New York. And she has written a book called Waste Siege. And it's a lot of the case studies are, she came on our project at Shukba. She was writing about the political use of garbage in Palestine, of rubbish. And this was obviously a perfect example for her to find out. And she goes into great detail on where all this garbage comes from, how we can remove it, things like that. So it's something we're actively working on, yeah.
Thank you so much. I guess my question is a follow-up to the gentleman about the site itself, and I would love to hear from the conversations that you've had, because earlier you said that you're seeking funding to continue the work, and I would love to know how politicized is that work, because it predates the civilization that exists in this area. So from your experience, and maybe this is a counterproductive question or counterintuitive, but I would love to hear how politicized, given that it is in a conflict zone.
Do you mean given that it's prehistory, is it still politicized? I mean,
yeah, exactly, because it's prehistoric, so it predates Palestine and the Israeli occupation as we know it. But
well, as I say, as I was trying to sort of allude to at the beginning, you know, the initial politics of a prehistory project are that firstly it was a colonial import, so it was in, you know, the kinds of research questions, the chronological framework, everything was imported by European archaeologists. Now what has happened is that since the Israelis took over prehistory, they have basically also taken that framework. And so basically it's really interesting, you know, they're reproducing an earlier colonial structure. You know, they're still using the same kind of terminology and so on, the same concepts and so on. So I want us to try to make a break with that. And so, I mean, that's how the prehistory has been dragged into that, the colonial and settler colonial politics. But I hope that we can make a break with that and start to think about it, you know, using perhaps indigenous concepts or more local concepts of land and landscape and memory and of, you know, technology and things, relationships with plants and animals, things like that. So, yeah, I mean, you can't, archaeology is always political in Palestine and Israel. It doesn't matter how old it is. I mean, because the main thing is, the Israelis are obsessed with origins. Well, most archaeologists are obsessed with origins, but the Israelis are really obsessed with origins, and this is something that Palestinians have been trying to counter as well. It's like, no, we were here first. We were, you know, Canaanite or whatever. And then, you know, I talk to people at Shukba, and they are so excited that, you know, like the Natufian Epipaleolithic 10,000 years ago, 15,000, that's long before the Israelis, that's long before the Jews arrived here. You know, this kind of thing. So it gets politicized even at that level, you know, trying to push back cultural origins and therefore territory further and further and deeper into the past. It's extraordinary. My goodness, lots of hands.
Hi there, thank you for such an interesting talk.
Shukran.
Shukran. We are from CBRL, and so lots of the research that you were talking about, Dorothy Garrod, and with Kathleen Kenyon, of course, was very familiar. We're doing a project at the moment talking about the connections that these female archaeologists had, and we've obviously come across Yusra, the Palestinian archaeologist working.
Yusra,
yeah. Did you do you have any more information than that you shared with us?
I'm so glad you asked, because I should have. Yeah. So the woman I mentioned that Garrod was hoping would come to Cambridge to do a master's degree, she was a little bit older than some of the other women there. She was maybe in her early 30s, something like that, and she had a small child. I think there's a photograph of Garrod with her somewhere. Yeah. But basically, what happened was, you know, when Garrod became the first woman professor in the UK of any subject. She became the professor of archaeology at Cambridge University, and one of the first things she did was at that time, only men were admitted to Cambridge University. And so in the early 1940s, Garrod was the person who secured admission from women to enter Cambridge University for the first time. And so Yusra would have been one of those women. But by the late 1940s, her family had been displaced. And at the moment, we've made contact with a filmmaker. I don't know if you know. I think his name is also Jamal. And he wants to make a documentary about Garrod, and he's trying to. He thinks that Yusra's family went to Iraq, and he's found a family there, and he showed them some photographs. And they said, yeah, we think that's Yusra. You know, the our grandmother's or great grandmother's family or something. So we've got this guy working on that at the moment. So we should talk, and I'll give you the details. Yeah.
Hello. I think I have a bit of a follow-up question on what you've been talking about. It's a bit of an open-ended question in a sense, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. I think on one end you mentioned this idea of Europeans coming into the region for that search of origins, and I think in my understanding, I'm not in any way related to archaeology, but that always exists in relative to an industry to do with museums and how we view things and this whole kind of concept. And so I think, for me, I would want to hear perhaps a case from your end on why you think, I understand the Israelis are excavating prehistory, and it's not lost on me the importance of all of this.
Sure.
But what perhaps, maybe from a more epistemological framework, and even kind of, what is the case that perhaps Palestinians have to gain today in their search for prehistory, or perhaps maybe a different narration of archaeology in that sense?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think Jamal might be more qualified to answer that, since he's a Palestinian archaeologist working on this. But I mean, I was surprised at how little prehistory is now being taught in the Palestinian universities, even at Birzeit. They do maybe a little bit in an introductory class or something like that. And I don't think it was always like that. In the 90s, for example. And I mean, so yeah, so basically, students are missing out on 1.5 million years of human evolution and human development, that they're not really getting that. And this region, it has the earliest human evidence outside Africa. So we've got East Africa with all the early hominins, and then the next place we find them is like 1.5 million years ago in the Jordan Valley, and so on. So that fascinating, the early human story, for example, is something that all archaeology students should know this, And then obviously I'm going to be biased because I work in the Natufian, but it's such an important, sort of pivotal development in human society that the students need to know this. I mean, they get very basic classes in it, but there's no department of prehistory anywhere, for example. Yeah. Does that kind of address your?
Maybe it's more. I think maybe the methods that I'm interested in hearing from you, and where you think, because it's in the end I'm sure it's we're not. I mean, this is available in a sense, but I'm sure that doing archaeology in Palestine is also about not reproducing, I think, those same logics in which archaeology, I think, has been done in European senses. And I'm kind of curious to see where you think there might be opportunities in collaboration, I think, with the projects that you've been seeing.
Sure. I mean, there's also methodological developments that I think are important. That the way in which archaeological sites are excavated in Palestine, for example, and also in Israel. Many of the big biblical sites, for example, Bronze Age, Iron Age, biblical, are still very much excavated in the old way, aren't they? Like these giant box grids and things like that. Whereas, you know, prehistory is a much more refined kind of excavation process and much more sophisticated, I think, you know. In terms of, we use dental tools, you know, it's really, you know, so even methodologically, I think there's some interesting developments that that's what we're trying to do, to train students in modern techniques and things like that as well, yeah. I've got no voice left. One more. We have time for one more. Okay.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. Maybe I have a question. So what's the rough timeline of how these civilizations changed? For example, from Natufians to Canaanites to later civilizations, and how does this cave fit into that narrative?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I should have made that clear. Everyone always wants a timeline. It's such these, you know, prehistoric time depth. So the cave at Shukba it belongs to what we call the Epipaleolithic, which is the later part of that, which dates, as we know now, from radiocarbon dating, from about 15,000 to about 10,000 years ago. And it's around 10,000 years ago that we start to see the domestication of plants and animals. And that's as we move into what is called the pre-pottery Neolithic, 10,000 years ago to 7,500 years ago. And then the Neolithic, and then the Chalcolithic, and then the historical periods, basically, biblical periods after that, yeah.
Was this cave used throughout the entire periods you mentioned, or within only the first one?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand.
So the cave was only in the first period you mentioned?
The cave, there's two archaeological horizons in the cave. One is extremely old, which is where the Neanderthals are. That's about 50,000 years old. And that's what we call the Middle Paleolithic. And then the Natufian material is Epipaleolithic later, about 10, 15,000 years ago. But yeah, so it's 50,000 years ago. We have the first inhabitation of the cave and presumably the landscape by a Neanderthal community. Yeah.
Thank you.
One. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. Shukran. Thank you. That's great questions. Thank you.